Gosh, so many people here. This is like the biggest group ever. People keep coming. Wonderful. So for those who haven't been here before, this is less of a sutta class and more of a discussion where we can share our experiences or responses to what's being discussed and really make it personal to ourselves. In other words, see how far we can relate to these teachings and apply them to our lives. And hopefully, it'll be quite relatable today in many ways for many of us here, and interesting for all of us here because we're going to read some suttas from the Bhikkhuni Samyutta. So I think so far in this sutta discussion group, we've mainly focused on kind of suttas from the Kanda Samyutta and the Dana Samyutta about the nature of this body and mind and causality of suffering. What else have we talked about? Spiritual friendship quite recently. We've talked about the Metta Sutta, etc. But we've not really heard many of the voices from the Bhikkhunis. So I thought today that might be nice because there is a whole chapter in the Samyutta Nikaya with discourses from Bhikkhunis. And much of the time, these discourses give you a little bit of background story. And then quite often, some kind of rebuke that Mara makes to the bhikkhuni. In other words, something that Mara, which is the personification of our own kind of negativities in a way, or inner doubts or whatever, the forces that try to prevent us from going deeply into meditation or becoming enlightened, this Mara turns up and tries to sway the bhikkhuni from the path. And it's usually impossible by now because all the bhikkhunis are actually arahats in the Bhikkhuni Samyutta. They're fully enlightened already. So even they still get these voices coming to them, but they know how to respond. So that can be inspiring for our own practice because sometimes when those voices come in, we really buy into them. We really think, oh, this must be true. I'm actually hopeless. I'm never going to be able to do this. I don't know if sometimes you even might have some internalized patriarchy or even internalized prejudice in some way, depending how you've been treated in society or, by your friends and family even sometimes. And so sometimes these voices are not our own voices as such. They're the voices that we've been around. And I think it's really helpful to be able to start identifying these as imposters, not as voices to follow or believe, but imposters. And the classical response also in the suttas, here we get more nuanced responses, but often in our meditation, it's enough to say, Mara, I know you. And then there's some suttas in the main Pali Canon that say, Mara then with shoulders hunched and head drooping, slinks away. Oh, the bhikkhuni knows me, she knows me, she knows me. In other words, Mara is defeated simply by being aware that this is not something that's for our benefit. This is not something we need to follow or believe in. So imagine if we could really do that, how much less suffering there would be right away. Because I think, in our practice, there can be pains in the body, there can be physical discomfort, weariness, etc. But I would say the majority of suffering in our lives comes from our belief in our thoughts a lot of the time, right? And then, of course, those thoughts feed emotions. Emotions then consolidate, become stronger, and lead to more thoughts of the same that reinforce and justify those emotions. And the whole cycle keeps going. So if we can just sometimes cut through these voices and see that this is just Mara getting scared. I once asked Ajahn Brahm, how is it that sometimes people are practicing for many years and, they're good practitioners, but it takes them quite some time to get some stillness in their mind. Whereas some retreatants seem to come, say, to Bodhinyana for the Vassa. They might have just been on a shopping trip to a big supermarket. Or they might even come wearing their makeup and all the rest. And they sit down and within an hour, they get like really good nimittas and start getting into deep samadhi. And I'm like, how is this possible? Because then they go back into that world and they don't seem to, necessarily take it that much further. Wouldn't they just want to keep going? And he says, well, the reason that it's sometimes easier when you're only doing this for a short time is because you're not such a threat to Mara. So Mara doesn't really bother with you because Mara knows you're going to go back to the world. You're going to, not really kind of give him a lot to worry about. And that's because Mara is actually one of the celestial beings, believe it or not, that wield control over others' creations. So this means that Mara is likes to keep you in the realm of samsara, likes to keep you under their control, under his control. Have you ever known anyone like that in your life? He likes to wield control. And you don't understand why they're doing it, it's just they seem to do it for the sake of just having that control. It makes them feel good about themselves, or it makes them feel important in some way. It maybe, gives them a very strong identity, self-identity. And they get worried when you say no, you want to do it another way. So Mara gets very worried when we start to meditate and actually start to slip beyond his realm. And they say that when you're in the jhana states, in other words, beyond the five senses, that's where Mara cannot find you anymore. And of course, when you actually go deeper than that, and somebody who's, extinguished, fully extinguished, either at parinibbana or even before that, when they have a taste of enlightenment, of nibbana, they're completely off the radar. There's no way they can be found. So anyway, that's a little bit of background. And I think I'll get into some of these suttas and we can just see whether we can relate to some of these situations in our own lives and whether we can feel inspired by these bhikkhuni's responses, which of course contain a lot of Dhamma in them. Does that sound good? Shall we begin? So I'll read the first one and we'll see if there's some conversation coming up around that. So this is called Alavika. So this is the name of one of the Bhikkhuni Arahats in the Buddha's day. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. Then, in the morning, the Bhikkhuni Alavika, dressed and taking the bowl and robe, entered Savatthi for alms. When she'd walked for alms in Savatthi and had returned from her alms round, after her meal she went to the blind man's grove, seeking seclusion. Then Mara the evil one, desiring to arouse fear, trepidation, and terror in the Bhikkhuni Alavika, desiring to make her fall away from seclusion, approached her and addressed her in verse. There's no escape in this world, so what will you do with seclusion? Enjoy the delights of sensual pleasure. Don't be remorseful later. Then it occurred to the Bhikkhuni Alavika, now who is it that recited that verse? A human being or a non-human being? Then it occurred to her, this is Mara, the evil one, who has recited this verse desiring to arouse fear, trepidation, and terror in me, desiring to make me fall away from seclusion. Then the Bhikkhuni Alavika, having understood this is Mara the evil one, replied to him in verses. There is an escape in the world, which I have closely touched with wisdom. O evil one, kinsman of the negligent, you do not know that state. Sensual pleasures are like swords and stakes, the aggregates like their chopping block. What you call sensual delight has become for me non-delight. Then Mara the evil one, realizing the Bhikkhuni Alavika knows me, sad and disappointed, disappeared right there. So that was her reply. So I really like this, and it's interesting that even in those days, and this is how we try to organize our lives even now in monasteries, the bhikkhunis would take their food in the morning. So they'd go on their sort of physical duties in the morning. If they were staying in monasteries, they might sweep the monastery and take care of the arrangements there, clean the Dhamma hall, etc. But after that, then they go to seek seclusion. So here it says that she was seeking seclusion. It doesn't just mean physical seclusion, but it also means seclusion from the world of the five senses. And that's basically kaya viveka, which is bodily seclusion by going to a quiet place. And the blind man's grove was a forest. And also mental seclusion, chitta viveka, which means to be secluded in the states of jhana. So one of the definitions of jhana is paviveka sukha, the same word viveka. So the happiness, the bliss that comes from seclusion, and that means being secluded from the five sense world. So perhaps she wasn't in very deeply, I'm not sure, but this Mara came up, you see, at that point, trying to make her fall away from that state. And it's quite interesting that it was the recognition that allowed her to dismiss him with these wonderful verses. There is an escape in the world which I've closely touched with wisdom. O evil one, kinsman of the negligent, you do not know that state. Because Mara is still entrapped in that sensual world. Sensual pleasures are like swords and stakes, the aggregates like their chopping block. What you call sensual delight has become for me non-delight. Which reminds me of another little sutta in the Pali Canon, and I forget where it is, where I think the Buddha says, what the noble ones say is happiness, the worldlings say is pleasure. What the worldlings say is, the worldlings say is suffering. What the worldlings say is happiness, the noble ones say is suffering. So here she's saying non-delight. But it sounds like a bit more than non-delight, doesn't it? Aggregates are like their chopping block, swords and stakes. It's quite strong language. Someone's put in, the reference there. That's to Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. I would assume it's the same one, unless I have an older copy of the Samyutta Nikaya, and there might be a different translation in Bhante Sujato's translation. Might be slightly different. Yeah. Any comments or questions so far? What does that bring up for anyone? Is this even relatable? Sensual pleasures are like swords and stakes. It's quite strong, isn't it? Can you speak? Yeah. Maybe, yeah.
Come closer.
Come a bit closer, maybe, just to be sure. Yeah, if you don't mind.
I have experience.
Can you speak up?
Yeah.
Come closer, whispering.
I have experience noticing sensual pleasures as swords and stakes. And I'm just noticing that the pain that comes from that craving itself has been a really interesting thing to observe in my practice in the last few years. Yeah, I'm curious if anyone else has noticed the pain of sensual pleasures or sensuality.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. You notice it while it's happening, or?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
And sometimes after a little while, it's like, oh, there it is pulling on me.
Yeah, poking you around. Yeah. Anyone else like to speak to that? Has anyone else noticed? Yeah, Ravi.
I noticed you become agitated, restless. Same like Anagarika said. Some pull.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Far away from contentment, isn't it?
Yeah.
Far away from contentment. I remember when before I was ordained, and I was on my way to sort of, I found a monastery, actually. Or had I? I don't think I'd yet found the monastery, but I was, I'd been searching for about 10 years, and it was just before I actually got to know of this monastery that I then knew would be where I ordained. This thing came up where there was a very good Dhamma friend, and suddenly I started having different types of feelings. And I was kind of like taken aback because I had this kind of feeling like a kind of intoxicating pleasure in the body, like kind of almost, I just described it as bittersweet, but it felt like it was mixed with trepidation and a lot of danger, actually. And I remember the word adinawa kept coming up. I think Goenkaji used to use that word a lot. Ardinawa is dangerous. But it really felt that way because I was so bent on ordination. I could feel this could be a massive hindrance, but it wasn't just that. It was the actual sensation itself was so agitating and so disturbing to the mind, compared to, because we did a lot of work with Vedana, and compared to very subtle, neutral feelings where you're really in contact with their passing. This was very agitating. I was still in contact with its arising and passing, which was quite intense, but it was much more coarse. So it felt dangerous and intoxicating, I would say. Yeah. I'll come to Karin and then to the chat.
Thank you, Venerable. I think it's rather complex, isn't it? I'm struggling with food greatly. So, and I can feel the moment I've swallowed the food, I can sense the discontent. Even the pleasure doesn't last long.
Yeah.
But the illusion can be very strong. And then if I deny myself, then I guess you can say Mara then is working very hard, because that's not the deal. You're not denying me.
Yeah.
So the mental debate starts. It's totally nonsensical. And to step out of this and to observe it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to step out rather than bang deny. I'm trying to come out of it, and as you just described, actually observe what's going on, what's this all about, wanting and not wanting.
Yeah.
That's the bigger picture, rather than I will not have this, I will not eat, I will not do this.
Absolutely. Very, very good point. Yeah, that it's not about the object. There's nothing inherently wrong in food. It's okay to actually enjoy food, but it's the wanting and the not wanting that is causing the pain in the mind, isn't it? It's that struggle that we're having, in the mind, and the delusion, like you called it illusion, but I think that's what you meant. Like this idea that, if I eat this, I'm going to feel better. Like it's going to change things dramatically in my life, if I have one more bite of a biscuit or something. And
not that powerful, unfortunately.
But there's the hope, isn't there? I think in all of us, that we can find that happiness and satisfaction through the senses, even though we know it's not possible, but we still wish it was. I think this is, a big thing to observe. And yeah, I think the aim, like you say, is not sort of to have more or to have less or whatever, but it's to come to a balanced perspective on the reason that we eat, right? In the case of food, it's like, where is that food helpful? And it's good to have some flavor to it because it helps you digest, it helps you, all the digestive juices start, and it's more nourishing for the body. And where is it that we're turning to food to fill a lack, especially an emotional lack sometimes. Yeah. And not to judge it at all, but just to watch. So I think that's very wise, actually, to have that perspective, just step back and watch the dynamic. Yeah. I'm going to come to the chat because it's been a while, and then to Johnny. What you call sensual delight has become for me non-delight. So that's the phrase in the Bhikkhuni's reply. So Benjamin says, I think this is when people tell me about the parties they've been to or the fancy food they've been eating. Very relatable. Yeah, right? Yeah. parties and fancy food, that's one thing. Yeah. And that's, yeah, to me, definitely suffering, actually. Where was it yesterday? We just walked along the river and then we came back sort of through a little gate and it takes you alongside a pub which is on the river and it's a beautiful spot to sit in. And I thought, oh, maybe when Ajahn Brahm's here, he could have some fish and chips there. And I said, oh, I'm not quite sure I want to poke my head in because there's a bar in there and it's, even though it was outdoors, I thought it's going to be kind of a yucky atmosphere. But anyway, I poked my head around the corner into the courtyard and there was this stench of beer, but also aftershave and perfume, all mixed up. It was really gross. It was so bizarre because you had two horrible smells that really clash. But I don't know. I suppose people are inured to. I mean, they were so strong, especially in contrast to just being by the river. So yeah, it just feels that the more peace we develop inside, the more contentment, the more agitating sense impingement of even not unnecessarily unwholesome type can be. Just unnecessary, isn't it? Just unnecessary. And then we feel relief. What is it? The joy of missing out instead of the fear of missing out. So, oh, I don't actually need the party or the fancy food. Yeah. Johnny, can you unmute?
I unmuted. I think yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Hello.
Hi.
So I have a reflection and a question. So reflection first on the question about something that I've reflected on.
I think you've dropped out actually. The connection seemed unstable and now you've gone quiet.
Quite a lot.
Try it a little bit and let's see if it comes.
Me thinking it. Okay, can you hear me now?
Seems okay. Keep going.
Okay, great. So I don't know where I dropped out, so I'll just
start again. Maybe
cut it off and go straight to the point. Okay, so in relation to the sort of happiness from, say, sensual pleasures, I've reflected a lot on, it seems that there does seem to be some delight. It has a particular more hedonic flavor, but there does seem to be some delight in it. And I find it helpful to put it within a framework of the Buddha's standards for what he was actually looking for happiness, like happiness that lasts. So it's maybe kind of a spectrum of how much happiness you can get from it, rather than, I don't know, rather than yeah. So yeah, it's like, what is the potential for happiness within these pursuits? So that's the reflection. And then the question is, you were talking about the kind of location of the problem. Is the location of the problem in the object or how the object is related to? And I think I remember at least that Ajahn Chah said in response to a monastic who wanted to continue to be able to handle money, that they could do that, but it would be the same as, but only if, or it's the same kind of thing as being able to eat salty food, but it not to taste salty. So the thrust of the point was that, I mean, there's a reason why there's this rule to not handle money, just because actually putting that into practice is really difficult. So I don't know how that would sit with what you were saying about it being in the object or not.
Yeah. That's an interesting one. I mean, to me, what comes up with that is that because a monastic takes on certain virtues, they're sort of cleaning, if you like, the cloth of the mind. So if you imagine the mind like a cloth, the cloth has become a lot cleaner because of the precepts, because of the training. And so even if you do something which is ethically quite neutral, such as handle money, for a monastic, because their mind's so pure and because that's actually one of the precepts not to do that, that is quite a big smudge on that cloth. And so it actually stands out. Whereas if you have a cloth that's already full of stains and smudges and it's pretty mucky, you're never going to notice the little smudge that comes from handling some money. It's not the big problem, right? You've got bigger problems. You've got maybe extreme problems if you're actually breaking 5 precepts, for example. You know, those things are going to be what sort of blight the mind. They're going to be what dirty the cloth. So the smaller things aren't going to be very important at all. But for a monastic, you're trying to get that cloth completely clean. And so I think what he was saying is that will then, yeah, sure, you can do it, but you're going to notice the impact that has on the mind. So I think it becomes subtler and subtler as we practice, you know, and what initially seems like quite an not necessarily unwholesome pleasure, for example, listening to music, which is kind of cool, that you like, that's, you know, there's lots of music I like that's not necessarily peaceful, but I think it's brilliant musicianship. I think they're brilliant musicians. But for me now, it's very coarse. And it's not that it's wrong or that, you know, it's leading to, I don't know, any lower realm. But it's just that compared to the peace inside, it's much more agitating than it used to be. So I think things are very relative. And I think on the whole, we're inclining our minds to increasingly subtle joy and happiness. So sensuality starts to feel really coarse. I always remember the time that I was in some nice meditation, like it was a retreat and I was kind of, you know, flowing with it for quite a few days with a lot of piti and a lot of continuity, no thoughts impinging on the mind, and just a lot of mental energy and piti. And almost by habit, I thought I'll just go outside and look at the lake because it's kind of break time, sort of in the middle of the afternoon. I'll just stand there. I didn't have any inclination to walk in the forest. I didn't need to. I was just happy inside. And after about 2 minutes of looking at the lake, it's like, yeah, that's enough. That's just enough, because it's just taking me to the Iceland door and I didn't need to be there, actually. I don't actually need that. Whereas normally in everyday life, I get a lot from nature because it's so peaceful compared to being at the computer. So I don't think there's really too much value judgment in Buddha's teachings. I think it's more obviously where it's not transgressing the virtue, but certainly we start to become increasingly aware that the sensual pleasure is a lesser, coarser, more inferior kind of happiness than the happiness available inside. Yeah. So we just naturally sort of move away. And yeah, to the first part of your question or reflection, the Buddha did say there's a gratification, and that is the danger there. You know, that is the danger in sensuality, that there is a gratification. So if there wasn't, we wouldn't have a problem, would we? But they are impermanent, and that's why they can't be a source of happiness, lasting happiness. All right, I'm coming to Joseph's comment. The term sensual pleasures seems so broad, it almost becomes abstract and hard to empathize with on an effective level. It's such a broad spectrum, from a concert to birdsong, for one example. Does anyone else ask what we're actually talking about when we're talking about sensual pleasures? It's like only using the word color but never saying blue or green or red. Would it be okay if we could discuss more concrete examples? Would you like to do that, Joseph, or would anyone else like to do that? To discuss a concrete example. I mean, you've used one here, which is the bird song as opposed to the concert, and I think I sort of spoke to that already, right? The difference between, say, you know, working hard, doing wholesome things, but working hard with a lot of input, say, from the screen, right? If I'm doing the newsletter, I'm seeing all kinds of photos and pictures, and it's all very nice, but it's a lot. And then compared to that, being by the river in Oxford is very peaceful. But if I'm sitting in my meditation kuti and getting into some peace and some bliss, then going outside and looking even at the most simple piece of nature is quite agitating in comparison, or at least unnecessary, you know, and kind of takes me away from the happiness within, which is actually starting to arise because I'm secluded, increasingly secluded from the senses. So that is one example. But yeah, I agree. And it could be that in this one, when it's talking about sensual pleasures being like swords and stakes, I think it is talking about, sensual pleasure as in sexual pleasure, right? Because Mara usually comes to these bhikkhunis, surprise, surprise, and tries to tempt them. So people might think, oh, it must be that women have a lot of lust. No, Mara has a lot of lust. And he's trying to tempt these bhikkhunis who don't have any lust. And so he's actually saying, what are you going to do being secluded all on your own in the forest? I mean, there's other suttas where he's literally saying, don't you want to enjoy yourself with a beautiful black-haired young man? You yourself have got beautiful eyes and you're in the prime of life. And don't you want to enjoy those kind of sensual pleasures? And that's what she's referring to as swords and stakes. And there's other suttas in the Pali Canon that talk about that kind of sensuality being really lost the word now. It wasn't dangerous as much, but painful, actually, and leading to all kinds of conflict in the world. It leads to adultery, it leads to rape, it leads to theft, it leads to murder, right? People get crazy about sensuality, especially sexuality. If you're obsessed with a person and there's somebody else, sleeps with that person or this person, or you try to leave, how many cases of domestic abuse are there where the person is killed after trying to leave an abusive relationship? This is all to do with the dangers of sensual pleasure. So it goes to those extremes. Yeah. Okay. I've had dreams where I've been in a room with a few people and someone was upset about my keeping the precepts. And the person in the dream told everyone else not to worry as he will sort the problem. So you've had dreams where you've been in a room with a few people and someone was upset about keeping the precepts and the person told everyone else not to worry. That's kind of nice. You had backup there. Yeah, it's good when you can dream about actually sticking to your precepts, isn't it? That's really nice. There's another example here. I'll come to you, Joseph, shortly. As Asians, we have family gatherings, good food, sing-alongs, have a good time with family, which shows the young generation what family values are. I'm confused now. Does that lead to suffering? Again, the Buddha's not making a value judgment. It's for you to discern what leads to suffering and what doesn't. And if the point of doing this is to, build family relations and show the younger generation the beauty of family and family values, then it's wonderful. The motivation is very wholesome, and there's compassion in that. But you've probably noticed for yourself that sometimes in these family gatherings, it starts out with good food and a sing-along, and after a while you start eating a bit too much, or you carry on wanting to sing along even when you're tired, and it all becomes a bit almost desperate. You can't quite kind of calm down, and it just turns a little bit stale at some point. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's a limit to the amount of happiness we can get from that. So I think it's for you to notice, how much is enough, how much is, really inspiring the younger generation, and also give them some time for some quiet as well, because some of the family values that we can teach might be being together quietly or just giving each other space. So I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with that. But it's a reflection that invites you to see where these things start to feel a little bit too empty for us, and where the spiritual path also needs to be part of what we practice and teach, as in the pleasure of the mind and the silence. I'm going to come to Joseph, if you maybe have thought of an example.
Something's coming up with, I think it was a teaching that Ayakema, who said, I think it's in her book, like being no one, going nowhere. She talks about the escape from sensual happiness is social happiness. So the Brahma Viharas.
Mm.
And what's coming to mind is like the questions of Saka Sutta, where he says that the cause of conflict is stinginess and envy. So I'm just thinking about if Mara comes to tempt us, it's tempting us with sensual pleasures. Is there skillful means that we can, oh, Mara, I've heard you were in a very high heaven. That must have been very meritorious of you to achieve that. That's wonderful. And then kind of rejoicing in Mara's, and then the happiness of that mudita would, what else would we be interested in through wisdom? And kind of being a friend, not seeing Mara as an enemy, but as like just turning it around. What do you think of that?
I think that's really nice. I think it's different approaches at different times. You just try whatever means works. And it is a nice approach because it's not making, as you say, Mara an enemy. I don't think we're making him an enemy anyway. We're just noticing when the voice in our mind isn't helpful and we're saying, I know you. We're not saying, go away, you're terrible, you're evil, you're horrible. We're just saying, I know you. And that's already enough, right? So I wouldn't say that's making them an enemy. But if they do continue to persist even then I do think having some loving kindness is really good. It could be to that voice itself or to your own personification of Mara, or it could be to yourself who's having to suffer this. Like, actually, this is hard to sit here now with this tyrannical voice in my head that's telling me I'm no good. This is painful, and empathizing with yourself. So I think just working with what's arising in whatever way feels pertinent to you. I don't think there's one way to do it each time that's going to work. And also, our aim should be to be aware of what's happening and to find a skillful response more than the aim being to make it go away. That makes sense. Because it's all about what we're doing with our mind, how we're relating to these situations. If it was to make them go away, I mean, Bhikkhunis wouldn't still be having them, would they? They're fully enlightened already. So they've obviously not got rid of them. So it's maybe the fact that you can't get rid of these voices, but you can respond in a way that basically cuts through any possible suffering they can create. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's my intuitive response. Yeah, Chi.
I can say that makes sense to me. Sometimes, often, if I am doing more intensive practice, I feel there's a serial complainer. And it doesn't matter what it is, it just enjoys complaining. But if I try to push it aside, it just simply doesn't work. So I actually, in my head, I open a complaints team, which is me, to hear the different complaints. And then it's kind of like, okay, me, what's wrong? What do you need? Kind of. And making adjustments at times. And then at some point, it kind of becomes, I've had the complaints, now there's simply nothing more I can do for you.
Right.
It's time to close the office. Because I can't, I've had it, I really listened to you complaining for a while. And it kind of loses that complaining energy much more. But the intent isn't to lose it, it's just pushing it aside.
Yeah.
Just makes it almost the complainer more powerful.
Fantastic. Yeah. But that's really playful, skillful means, actually, because you're both giving voice, if you like, giving kind of attention to these voices and saying, okay, let me know what it is. And then it's like, okay, knowing when that's enough, knowing when you've kind of, attended to those things enough, and now it's just going to continue. So just at that point, do you disengage?
And it loses energy. It's almost like, okay, anything else? Oh no, I've already complained about it. You said you can't help, so
that's good.
Anything else? No, okay.
Yeah. It's a little bit almost like saying, yes, Mara, come on, Mara, what more? Come on, Mara. Without bringing it on, but it's a similar thing in a way. Yeah. That sounds very skillful to me. I like that. A complaints team. And it's also very boundaried, you know, because it's like there's this panel.
Yeah.
And then once the panel, which is kind of stronger than the individual, right? It's a whole kind of team. Once it's gone through that system, then there's and I think that's a really good way of training the mind. Rather than it being a bit hiddly-piddly, I'll just try this randomly and this randomly. There's like a system. That's very skillful. Yeah. Okay. I feel like Mara creeps up more when I'm around people. Might it be because I don't have Dhamma friends in my physical surroundings and everyone I meet is drawn towards noise, music, alcohol, etc.? So I find myself constantly looking for solitude and silence, though that doesn't please my family much. What's the middle way here? Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you are constantly looking for solitude and silence, but if you are, then it sounds like you might be missing the step of trying to embrace and make peace with what is actually around you at that time first. So I think there are things we can learn in situations that we don't enjoy being in, as well as situations which we want. So I don't know if this really relates to the sutta, but in a sense, the monastic life brings that kind of balance, because in the morning, the monastic has to go into the towns, into the villages, and they might get abused, and there might be all kinds of things going on. Dancing girls on poles are mentioned in the suttas, and you know, kind of weird dog aesthetic people who pretend to be dogs, and people who throw things at you, and all kinds of things happen. And the Buddha intended that to be the case. Not that people would obviously look for that, but that you would need to see the realities of life and encounter situations that weren't always pleasant. And it was considered a sign of strength in the practice when someone was able to go to a rough place, for example, where they might not receive much respect, they might not receive much food. You have to be quite developed for that. But he would try to, you know, include that as part of the day. And then after lunch, when you've done that, in other words, when you've been around your family, you've been around people with, you know, who are being noisy or drinking alcohol, you can then say, okay, well, may they be well, it's now my time to find some peace and to find a situation where I can meditate and let some of that go. So to constantly be trying to move away from it, I think, is problematic, simply because it's not possible. And you'll probably find that it becomes a fight, becomes a struggle, and the people around you might start to feel a little bit judged, perhaps, or a little bit neglected or rejected. So yeah, it's tricky when that's everyone you meet, I must say. That's very tricky. I don't know if I've mentioned this to you before, but I wonder if you could start a little group, because it seems to me that you don't really have any meditation friends there. So there must be other people that would be interested in that. Isn't it the case that so often in social situations, we go towards the noisy places, the music and the alcohol, simply because that's what everyone else is doing and we want the company? And we actually would rather not drink, but we think we should drink in order to be included. And when the one person doesn't drink, then you think, oh, great, maybe I don't need to either. So if you give people a different option, you might start finding like-minded people, even if it's just one or two people, ever. It doesn't matter, because it's a space you can create together. And bit by bit, that starts drawing people in. You know, when I started this, there was no one in the country that even knew me, really, except my best friend and my parents. And there was certainly no support for bhikkhunis. There was actually an anti-bhikkhuni feeling here, because they'd tried to do that before and hadn't worked. And also the monks had now said, well, we're not going to do that at all. So I didn't know if there were these people. They don't even know that that's what they're after until you create the conditions for them to choose. So I think that might be something you could try. I do empathize. I do know that that's really difficult, because it will influence you. But it's great that you keep coming to these sutta discussions and the meditations, and that you can do a lot of those things online. Yeah, and just try and create that sort of bubble. But then when you go back outside, maybe have some metta. You know, at the end of a sutta discussion, at the end of a meditation, you know you're going to go back outside. You don't really want to. You know that you might feel averse. Try and open your heart to those people and just determine to treat them with a lot of gentleness. Try to, you know, listen to them and just express your care in a different way. Okay. Why aren't we creeping up on Mara, whispering, letting go? Ah, what bliss. Wouldn't it be so much easier to support the monastics? Isn't bothering the monks exhausting? Think of the joy of being kind and supportive to our spiritual friends. Yes, but now you're trying to teach Mara, which is also a kind of control. If it helps to say, oh, letting go, oh, what bliss, wonderful. But I'm not sure that actually trying to say, oh, you know, Mara, don't you feel exhausted by this? I mean, it might work. But if Mara is this being in the Paranimitta Vasavati realm, he's not going to budge very easily. You know, there's a lot of delusion there, and they're enjoying wielding power. So it could end up being a fight just with using slightly different words. That's my only concern. But try different things. You know, if your mind, it has to be relevant to the specific situation you're in. We can kind of think of it all in advance, but that's probably not what's going to come to your mind. So I don't know, it might work, but I think it's interesting to see the Bhikkhunis' responses here because they are loaded with Dhamma. And some of these are reminders that we can tell ourselves even before we meditate, even before Mara comes into our mind, to remind ourselves, you know, that if some sensuality comes up, it's less likely for it to take hold. You know, if we have that teaching in our mind, it's less likely to come up in the first place. But yeah, try different things. Shall we read one more? Because I wondered how many we might get to. It doesn't matter how many. But the next one's quite interesting because
Benjamin has the...
Oh, sorry. Do you have your hand up, Benjamin? I didn't notice. I think it was the same color as your screen. Sure, I'll come to you.
Yeah, just a little thing I thought of reading in the chat about being drawn towards noise and alcohol and such. It reminded me that when I was younger, sort of in my teenage years, my best friend lived above a pub and his parents were the pub landlords. So I spent a lot of time in actually the roughest pub in my town. And it was actually really beneficial for my practice. The reason is one of the easiest ways to learn is through contrast. So I'd be there, on the one hand, I'd be having a nice time with my friends and with his family who were nice people, but there are also these rough characters in the pub, drinking, swearing, carrying on. And I'd kind of get a very clear picture of, I'm over here doing this thing, they're over here doing that thing, and I can see and feel the difference very clearly.
Yeah.
Which I think kind of accelerated my practice.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. It becomes very obvious that that's a whole lot of suffering if it's so diametrically opposite in that sense. And it also can be a bit of a test of the practice. Yeah, like kind of validating why you've made the choices you have. It's slightly different, but sometimes in my life, you know, if I'm around people, say, and this is a bit different from sensual pleasure, but say if you're around people that you feel do it wrong, you know, they just don't do things like you would, right? Or then I can learn a lot from that as well. I can say, oh, this way of speech that they're using isn't actually very conducive to harmony. I will therefore try to learn how not to do the same. And that can be just as helpful as seeing somebody who does it the way that I think is really inspiring. I mean, it might mean I have to find my own way a little bit more. I might not have a positive role model necessarily, but at least I know what not to do. And I also sometimes know the consequence, the harm that can cause. Yeah. So thank you for that. That's great. And that might help you embrace the situation you're in. Boyana, because perhaps, you know, this is making your resolve much stronger, which is why I'm saying take that resolve and do something with it to create the kind of situation you would like to be in. That might be really good. Okay, one more from the chat, but I do want to get on to, I think I missed this one, Janaki. I think the happiness is attained not by changing the outside world, but how you look at the outside world or the worldly phenomena. Yes, that's right. And also, we do have to, sometimes we can't avoid certain external conditions, but as we become wiser about, cause and effect, we do start to, it is necessary to start to choose conditions or try to create conditions or incline to conditions that are going to be supportive. If it was entirely in the mind, right, entirely, and we could leave the outside world exactly as it is, then there'd be no need to come to a meditation center. There'd be no need to, live a monastic life. There'd be no need for spiritual friends, right? So there are some conducive conditions, sapaya, supports, that are going to help us on the path. But yeah, essentially, that also helps us to change our mind and the way we look at things. That's where the real work comes in. Yeah, so let's go for the next one. We don't have very long. But we can at least read through. And this is not so much about sensuality, but about gender discrimination. Has anyone ever experienced that? Okay, put your hand up if you have, because a few people are putting their hand up, but not everyone. Okay, wonderful. One man has his hand up. I don't know if you do identify as a male. Well, you do, and you've experienced it. Wow, awesome. Any other men there? Because it's mostly women with their hands raised. Yeah, one other too. Otherwise, mostly women, but there are more women here too. So discrimination on account of any external, you're trans, okay. Yeah, I'm really sorry to hear that you've experienced that discrimination. Yeah. It shouldn't be like that, should it? That you go, oh yeah, you're trans, that's why, that's just really sucks. And really, any discrimination based on such external, conventional realities is full of delusion. Full of delusion. Oh, what was the question? The question, I'm sure you're going to raise your hand now, you know the question, Annika, if you've ever experienced gender discrimination. But I don't know if I see your video or not. Yeah. It's interesting in the past before, yeah, you've got your hand up. In the past before I was in the, I guess this is privilege, in the past before I joined the Bhikkhuni Sangha, I would probably have said not really. I guess in India, yes, because in India, as a young Western woman with long hair and pale skin, then I was kind of a target, let's say, for unwanted attention, like every day by many, many people. And I suppose it was dangerous. It was dangerous. I mean, you wouldn't go anywhere, actually, that there wasn't a big crowd around on your own. Yeah. But since joining the Sangha, sadly, there's been a ton of discrimination because there's so many beliefs and wrong views that women are not, don't really deserve or don't really have a place in or aren't as good as male members of the Sangha. So there's a lot of gender discrimination. And also I've seen in monks' monasteries discrimination towards gay monks. There's obviously a lot of discrimination towards transgender people because I don't know, I've heard of one transgender person who was ordained. If you've read that story, it's on Handful of Leaves, Nikos. I don't know if you want to read that. It's nice, actually, because I didn't know about this story. Handful of Leaves website, they helped make the documentary with us called called Buddhist Nun on a Mission. And on their website, there's a story of the first ever transgender monk. And I don't know if they're the only one, but I was very interested in that. And it is hopefully going to change for transgender people, at least in some places. But gosh, it's painfully slow. So someone's saying that they were told something they experienced was discrimination, but not based on gender. I mean, there are so many types of justifications for discrimination, right? The wrong gender, the wrong race, the wrong sexual identity, the wrong anything that's different, anything that's not the majority, that's not the norm, is an excuse for people to be cruel. Anyway, okay, so that became another discussion before we read the sutta, but perhaps there's still time to read through. So this is Soma at Savatthi. Then in the morning, the Bhikkhuni Soma, dressed and taking bowl and robe, entered Savatthi for alms. When she'd walked for alms in Savatthi and had returned from her alms round, after her meal she went to the blind man's grove for the day's abiding. Having plunged into the blind man's grove, she sat down at the foot of a tree for the day's abiding. Then Mara the evil one, desiring to arouse fear, trepidation, and terror in the Bhikkhuni Soma, desiring to make her fall away from samadhi, approached her and addressed her in verse. That state is so hard to achieve, which is to be attained by the seers, can't be attained by a woman with her two-fingered wisdom. Then it occurred to the Bhikkhuni Soma, now who is this that recited that verse, a human being or a non-human being? Then it occurred to her, this is Mara, the evil one, who's recited the verse desiring to arouse fear, trepidation, and terror in me, desiring to make me fall away from samadhi. I'm saying samadhi instead of concentration, which means a kind of deep state of stillness or unification of mind. Then the Bhikkhuni Soma, having understood, this is Mara, the evil one, replied to him in verses. What does womanhood matter at all? Okay, so I've changed this translation because I don't like matter. It seems like it doesn't matter. You're a woman, but never mind, so it still sounds to me kind of like it's not a good thing, but it might not be an impediment. So I've changed it to how is womanhood relevant, or how is gender relevant at all when the mind is well stilled or well quieted? When knowledge flows on steadily as one sees correctly into Dhamma. To one to whom it might occur, I'm a woman, or I am a man, or I'm a trans man, or I am a non-binary person. It doesn't say that, but the next sentence includes it. Or I am anything at all is fit for Mara to address. So I'll read those last two verses again because I find them really powerful. So how is gender relevant at all when the mind is well stilled, when knowledge flows on steadily and as one sees correctly into Dhamma? One to whom it might occur, I am a woman, or I am a man, or I am anything at all, is fit for Mara to address. Then Mara, the evil one, realizing the Bhikkhuni Soma knows me, sad and disappointed, disappeared right there. And that's great. Janaki says, thanks, Ven Candā, for not using C, which means concentration. Yeah, because concentration implies that we're really trying to force our mind into one place, but actually the mind is settling because we've started to free the mind from the 5 hindrances through a lot of wisdom and letting go. So it's a much more holistic approach and a much more beautiful process. And the idea of stillness and settling is actually descriptive of the way into these states.